Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Burges Watson. You are watching W News, broadcasting live from the Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump showcase starkly different visions for the US in their first and only debate before the presidential election. The top US and UK diplomats are in Ukraine in a show of support for the war-torn country as Russia advances on the city of Pokrovsk. And as the death toll continues to rise in Gaza and the West Bank, the Israeli defense minister now says his forces will shift their focus to the northern border with Lebanon. A very warm welcome. There are just 8 weeks to go now until the US presidential election, and in a matter of days, early voting will begin in some US states. Well, last night, the Democratic candidate Kamala Harris and her Republican rival Donald Trump had what will in all likelihood be their one and only opportunity to make their case before a television audience of tens of millions of voters. Well, that highly anticipated presidential debate wasn't just watched by American voters, but by people right across the world. And today, people have been dissecting their performance. Well, immigration, foreign policy and healthcare were all discussed, but the debate also got rather personal. Harris delivered blistering attacks on Trump's fitness for office, and she cited the fact that senior Republicans had done the same thing.
You talk about extreme. This is, I think, one of the reasons why in this election I actually have the endorsement of 200 Republicans who have formerly worked with President Bush, Mitt Romney, and John McCain, including the endorsement of former Vice President Dick Cheney and Congress member Liz Cheney. His former Secretary of Defense has said the nation, the Republic, would never survive another Trump term. And when we listen to this kind of rhetoric, when the issues that affect the American people are not being addressed, I think the choice is clear in this election.
Kamala Harris speaking there. Well, for his part, Donald Trump lambasted Harris and labelled her a Marxist.
Everything that she believed 3 years ago and 4 years ago is out the window. She's going to my philosophy now. In fact, I was going to send her a MAGA hat. She's gone to my philosophy. But if she ever got elected, she'd change it. And it will be the end of our country. She's a Marxist. Everybody knows she's a Marxist. Her father's a Marxist professor in economics, and he taught her well.
Donald Trump speaking there. Well, let's get the latest now. We can cross to Washington and speak to our correspondent, Benji Haya, who joins us now. Benji, welcome to the programme. First up, I'd like to know what the pundits are saying about just who came out on top last night.
Well, this is a feature of American presidential debates, is the moment that the two candidates step off the stage, there is a compelling effort within the spin room by both sides, including, in fact, Donald Trump in person when he turned up shortly afterwards, to try to give their own narrative, to try to convince the media and those pundits watching that their side came out on top. But I think the very fact that Donald Trump felt inclined to turn up personally in that spin room, contrast that with Kamala Harris, who went off to a separate watch party / rally. I think that is indicative of how his side might feel in the way that it's gone for the former president. And indeed, Kamala Harris's team calling already for a second debate, illustrative of the fact that they feel that she performed very strongly against Donald Trump and that she managed to get under his skin, that the big topics on which the Harris campaign may have been vulnerable, the economy and immigration, instead was dominated by Trump making baseless conspiracy theories about migrants eating pets or false claims about the Democrats wanting to kill, exterminate, execute baby babies even after they are born. And I think that will be one of the main takeaways for Kamala Harris. And yes, she is tainted perhaps by the Biden administration's failures on foreign policy. Donald Trump saying, you've got all this plan that you want to do economically. Why haven't you done it already? You've had the opportunity. But Harris, on the other hand, can turn around and say this is a chance to move forward, to not look back on the past and to really lay out a vision for the future.
Yeah, Benji, we're going to come back to that quote about the pets being eaten in Springfield in just a moment. But I just want to ask you what stood out for you as being the knockout punches during the course of those 90 minutes?
I think there were many key topics that American voters will be paying attention to, the likes of the economy or immigration that always list as their top priorities. But ultimately, what stole the limelight were a couple of comments that Donald Trump made, separate from those allegations of eating pets that you mentioned. Number one is the stance on abortion. He refused to commit to vetoing a nationwide abortion plan, whilst Kamala Harris used that moment to express her support for a woman's right to choose. Additionally, Donald Trump was asked whether he acknowledged that he lost the election in 2020. He, of course, had faced criminal charges for those efforts to subvert democracy, to overturn the result of that vote that he lost. In response, he said, no, I don't acknowledge that loss at all, which opened the door, perhaps, for Kamala Harris to reach out to those undecided voters and say that if you ultimately believe in democracy, if you believe in the rule of law, then I am your candidate.
Benji, we've been saying the last couple of days that voters in the United States have been saying they don't feel like they really know much about Kamala Harris. They don't feel like they know her in the same way that US households know Donald Trump, who is a well-known entity, not just there but across the world. But do you think this perception of not knowing Kamala Harris has now changed as a result of last night's debate?
Well, she's had some opportunity to lay out her economic plan, to create an opportunity economy, as she calls it. The issue that she faces is twofold. One, that she is connected, entwined with what the Biden administration has done. And for many Americans, they don't approve of the current economic state of the country. And the other is that on many issues, she has kind of flip-flopped. She has changed her position, changed her stance, most notably on the topic of fracking, which goes to the very heart of America's energy policy, America's place in the world vis-a-vis climate change. And I think she's struggling to navigate that. Now, last night, she set out her stall to voters and said, you know, I very clearly have not changed in my values. But I think the Trump campaign will still want to highlight that she has changed on many issues. That is not to say that the former president hasn't done so himself. On issues like abortion, his stance has been very unclear as well. And whilst policies are important, personality is too, vibes key. It's not the thing that's going to necessarily win elections single-handedly. But one of the main takeaways from this debate will not just be what's said, but also the body language of both candidates, how they presented themselves to the American people. Trump's sort of aggressive positioning that he took, his scowling, cutting a figure of fury, versus Kamala Harris, who tried to maintain her composure in the face of the former president's attacks.
Yeah, you're right. The body language is incredible. It would have been even quite interesting to watch the debate without the volume on. But just lastly, and briefly, if you will, what stood out for you as being the most memorable quote or moment, rightly or wrongly, from last night's debate?
Well, I think we've got to hark back to what we touched upon at the top, which was the topic of immigration. Again, you know, this is really where Donald Trump is strongest, frankly. He, you know, rose to prominence during the 2016 campaign with his policy to build the wall along the Mexican border. And this was a chance for him to really hammer the vice president, who has, in some capacity, had the responsibility of overseeing the issue of abortion, instead reverting back to those conspiracy theories, which allowed Kamala Harris to paint him as extreme, as weird. And so I don't think he really landed those blows that he needed to on that one subject. And instead, the memes that are going viral are all about that baseless allegation that he made, very strange allegation, that Haitian migrants were coming into the country and eating people's pets.
Benji, let's take a listen to what Donald Trump actually said. Let's take a listen.
What they have done to our country by allowing these millions and millions of people to come into our country, and look at what's happening to the towns all over the United States. And a lot of towns don't want to talk. It's not going to be Aurora or Springfield. A lot of towns don't want to talk about it because they're so embarrassed by it. In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there. And this is what's happening in our country.
OK, Donald Trump speaking there in the debate last night. We're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Benji Hire, our correspondent in Washington. Thank you so much.
Donald Trump was fired by 81 million people.
What they have done to our country by allowing these millions and millions of people to come into our country, crime here is up and through the roof.
Well, I think this is so rich, coming from someone who has been prosecuted for national security crimes.
I felt the Vice President did a better job in explaining her plan for us.
Well, I think Donald Trump was a little bit more demure in terms of what we've seen in the past.
And remember this, she is Biden. You know, she's trying to get away from Biden.
Clearly, I am not Joe Biden, and I am certainly not Donald Trump.
You've seen the same act over and over again by Trump. It's like a child that is being told no.
His temperament's a lot calmer. He hasn't been as aggressive as he was in the past.
I feel like they're both not the right candidate for me, based on this debate and the past debate.
Well, staying with the US election, shortly after last night's TV debate, the singer Taylor Swift announced that she's going to be endorsing Kamala Harris. Observers say this is the most potentially significant celebrity endorsements that a US politician could ask for. 34-year-old Taylor Swift has one of the largest online followings in the world. She's estimated to have upwards of 500 million followers across all social media platforms. Well, within 15 minutes of her announcement on Instagram, it had more than 1 million likes. On Tuesday, the Kremlin said that President Putin would be unlikely to watch last night's presidential debate. Well, today, the Russian president's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, said that Moscow had not appreciated how Putin's name had been bandied around in the debate, and he urged the two candidates to stop dragging him into their political fight. Well, Russian state television described that debate last night as, quote, emotional. Well, last week, President Putin said in a teasing remark that he favored Harris over Trump. The ongoing war in Ukraine was a key theme in last night's presidential debate. And with that in mind, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy paid a visit to Kyiv today. They've been discussing Ukraine's request for long-range missiles. Well, the Kremlin has warned of a strong response to any Ukrainian strikes within Russian territory, highlighting the risks of escalating the conflict. Well, for more on this, I'm joined from Kyiv by Yuri Sak, who is an advisor to Ukraine's Minister for Strategic Industries and a former spokesperson for the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. Thank you so much for joining us here. What was the significance of this visit, do you think, by the top diplomats of the United States and the UK?
Good evening. In 2 days, President Zelensky will be in Washington, D.C., then in New York, and he'll be meeting with President Biden, and they will continue the discussion that has been ongoing for some time now. And of course, the significance of today's meeting is, very important because every time such high guests from our strategic partners like the United States and the United Kingdom come to Kyiv, it sends a signal primarily to the enemy, primarily to Russia. It sends a signal that our partners will stand with Ukraine. Our partners will not budge into this fear-mongering that Russia is engaged in. And, it gives hope also to the Ukrainian people because we see our friends standing with us.
Secretary of State Blinken suggested that long-range weaponry could be given to Ukraine and we presume then used against Russia. I mean, what's been agreed on that particular issue?
At the moment, this is work in progress. We have made our case very clearly to our partners why we need those long-range capabilities, because Russia continues to terrorize Ukraine on a daily basis. Actually, right now, there is an air raid siren, and people in Kyiv and other cities in Ukraine, they are rushing towards bomb shelters because we've just been warned that there is a ballistic missiles attack ongoing. So we have explained to our partners that, for us to be able to stop this terror, we need, in addition to our capabilities on the front lines, we need the ability to disable, incapacitate Russia's war machine where we can reach it. So Russian airfields from which these bombers take off, Russian launching sites from which they launch ballistic and other types of missiles and drones. So this is very obvious. We need those long-range capabilities simply to protect our people from being terrorized by the terrorist state Russia.
But isn't there a real risk here of a major escalation in the conflict? That's what Russia's warning.
Russia has been banking on fear for a very long time, and every time Ukraine would receive a new type of weapon system from our partners, we have all seen that, these mythical red lines have been crossed and nothing happens. So, we have received tanks, we have received multi-launch rocket systems, we have received Patriot systems, we have received now F-16s, and each time this was a hypothetical red line which Russia warned everybody not to cross. So we think that, for us, or for all of us, for the coalition of free nations, to help Ukraine win this war in which we are fighting for the values and stability of all of us, we need to stop being afraid of Russia talking about these red lines, and we need to equip the Ukrainian army with the tools that will help us finish the job.
And Yuri, just before we finish, just tell us what the latest is that you're hearing about the situation on the front line in the east of Ukraine.
The situation on the eastern front of Ukraine has been stabilized in recent days. Our commander-in-chief has reported that the advancements of the Russian troops have been slowed down by the Ukrainian defense forces, and we are doing all we need to do to stop them from advancing further, and we are focused on bolstering and strengthening our defenses.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Yuri Isak, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's get a brief check of some other stories we're following for you here on Arabiya. Vietnamese media has reported that 179 people have been killed due to Typhoon Yagi, which hit the north of the country during the weekend. Several communities are being cut off by the flooding and supplies are being delivered by boat. Around 145 people are still unaccounted for in the country. Up to 1 million people have been affected by severe flooding in northern Nigeria's Borno state. Well, the flooding was triggered by severe rainfall, and that caused a dam to overflow. Well, and amidst the devastation, a state-owned safari park has been flooded, and that washed crocodiles, snakes, and other dangerous animals into the water, and that poses a risk for communities. And students in India's Manipur province are demanding an end to the violence in the region. Manipur has seen continuing ethnic tensions in recent months, which has at times turned deadly. Well, internet and mobile services have been suspended for 5 days now, and there's been an indefinite curfew imposed in some areas of that province.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
We're going to turn now to the latest in Gaza, where it's been reported that an Israeli airstrike hit a school today. This happened in Nuseirat, which is in central Gaza. Well, according to Hamas, 14 people, amongst them women and children, were killed there at the school, which is being used to house displaced people. Well, Israel says it was targeting militants there. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Red Crescent says at least 5 people were killed in an Israeli strike in the West Bank earlier today. That happened in the northern city of Tubas. Well, Israel says it was targeting militant groups in that area, but gave no further details. Meanwhile, on Israel's northern border with Lebanon, there's been fresh violence in the last 24 hours. The Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has indicated that his forces will be shifting their focus to that northern border area with Lebanon.
מרכז הכובד עובר צפונה. אנחנו לקראת השלמת המשימות שלנו בדרום, אבל יש לנו כאן משימה
Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by military analyst Sean Bell. Thank you so much for joining us here on Arabiya News. The Israeli Defense Minister, we just saw a brief clip of him there, has indicated that attentions are now going to shift to the northern border. He says, mission nearly accomplished in Gaza. Does that sound credible to you?
Well, like all these things, I think there's a whiff of truth in that. But actually, what the headlines really are that there are negotiations ongoing at the moment looking to how do you bring the conflict to an end, ceasefire. And I think Antony Blinken announced just the other day that 90% of the work was done. If that deal isn't done, then Hezbollah and the Houthis and Hamas will try to fire up more action planned by Iran. And as a result, it's pretty clear what Israel's doing now is bolstering its defences in the north in preparation, A, to act as a deterrence for Hezbollah launching any further attack, but also making sure they're ready should that day happen.
OK, so we might be looking, therefore, at a real escalation on both sides of the northern border, therefore.
I'm not sure that's true. I think at the core of the dangers, we keep reporting on symptoms. The actual disease here is that at the start of the conflict, Prime Minister Netanyahu made 2 priorities: to destroy Hamas and to free the hostages. But it's been pretty clear for the last 11 months where his priority has laid. Now, with the military action largely over in the Gaza, it's still ongoing, but on a much lower level. Inevitably, questions are looking at how to free the hostages. And frankly, the only way to get the hostages out is through negotiation. Back in November last year, over 100 were freed with a ceasefire. Since then, 8 have been freed through military action, but huge numbers have been killed through military action. Most recently, 6, tragically, when the IDF tried to launch a rescue operation. And what Hamas is doing clearly is saying that if you try to rescue them by military force, they'll be killed. Therefore, there has to be a negotiated solution. Now, Netanyahu clearly doesn't want to make peace with Hamas just yet. Therefore, he's covering his bases by making sure that the northern axis to Hezbollah is protected, whilst also negotiating. But whether we'll see a lasting peace or not, I think the jury's still out.
So, I mean, it doesn't sound as though you think that a broader regional conflict is therefore the necessary, the likely turn of events as we move forward.
No, I think there's been, inevitably, it's a tinderbox in the region, but you only have to look back. Lebanon does not want to see another big war. It has already been devastated. It's got huge debts. It's got huge problems domestically. Hezbollah knows that it will get an incredibly bloody nose were its take on the Israeli Defense Forces, which are by far and away the most dominant military power in the region. But everybody is certainly the 3 H's, Hezbollah, Hamas and the Houthis, are being funded and supported and prompted by Iran Iran that wants to see Hamas emerge from these negotiations, survived and potentially still in some sort of power. So the stakes are very high, but it doesn't feel like any of the major players actually want this to escalate. But they clearly want to do a bit of brinkmanship to put pressure on those negotiations to try to make sure that Hamas at least stays in some form in Gaza, which of course is pretty clear Israel does not want that at all. And why I'm a little bit cynical, frankly, about the negotiations is they only work if both sides see benefit in doing so. At the moment, neither side has won. They're not at a stalemate, and the sort of compromises that Israel would have to make, it's pretty clear Prime Minister Netanyahu has no appetite for that at the moment.
Josep Borrell is visiting southern Lebanon right now. Is that a significant visit, do you think? And what's that likely to achieve?
I think there's a lot of political pressure going on at the moment to try to stop the war escalating. I mean, the one thing, my attention is less on Hezbollah, quite frankly, and more on Iran. You'll remember the assassination that took place well over a month ago now, that Iran vowed retaliation. And we've waited several weeks. That hasn't happened. And therefore, we fully expected in a matter of weeks that that would happen. Last time Iran retaliated, there were literally hundreds of missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles heading Israel's way. That felt a massive escalation. Now, Israel's kept its powder dry so far, and therefore it does appear to be that we'll have to wait and see the outcome of these negotiations. But there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes at the moment to try to calm the waters. But there's also a lot of big military presence, 2 US carrier groups in the region, 1 US submarine that's got a massive potential launching cruise missiles. There is a lot of military power in the region, which acts as a deterrent, but could end up having a pretty significant response should things get out of control.
Just lastly, supposing the Israelis let the Hamas leader, Yahya Sinwar, out of Gaza, what do you think they'd get in return? What would they be asking for in return if they were to do such a thing?
I think that's a really good question because, frankly, although Israel says it's the destruction of Hamas there as their objective, as a military guy, you know, that's an ideal Hamas. You can take out Yahya Sinwar, but Hamas is like a hydra. You chop off one head, another will emerge. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's less about the people and more about things like the Philadelphia corridor, which Israel moved into, because they've got to stop Hamas arming themselves. It's quite difficult for them to do that through the Mediterranean. It's very difficult to do it through the border with Israel. But the border with Egypt has traditionally been a way that Hamas has brought most of its arms and through smuggling. And therefore, that's why Prime Minister Netanyahu's put such an effort there. So I do think there's a lot at stake at the moment here. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, the other complication is clearly he's trying to maintain his grip on power as well. I think the next couple of weeks will be very interesting, both from a political perspective, but also militarily.
OK, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Really interesting there. Military analyst Sean Bell, thank you very much indeed. A couple of business news stories we're keeping an eye on for you here. The Reuters news agency is reporting that Samsung could be on track to cut up to 30% of the company's overseas workforce. The South Korea-based company, which is the world's top maker of smartphones, TVs and memory chips, hasn't yet made a formal announcement on this matter, but is reported to be aiming to reduce the global headcount and improve efficiency. Workers at Kenya's main international airport went on strike today, causing travel misery with numerous delays and cancellations. Unions say the industrial action is in opposition to plans for the airport in Nairobi to be leased to the Indian company, the Adani Group. Well, this, the unions say, would result in job losses and the importation of non-Kenyan workers. The British government says that Jordanian citizens can no longer obtain electronic travel authorization for visits to the UK. Instead, they'll have to apply for a visa. In a statement, London said the reason for this decision was multiple cases of Jordanian citizens misusing their ETA and engaging activities outside of the rules. Let's get a reminder of our top stories here on Arabiya News. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump showcase starkly different visions for the United States in their first and only debate before the presidential election. The top US and UK diplomats visit Ukraine in a show of support for the war-torn country as Russia advances on the city of Pokrovsk. And as the death toll continues to rise in Gaza and the West Bank, the Israeli defense minister says his forces are now going to shift their focus to the northern border with Lebanon. That is all we have time for. Coming up next is the Riz Khan Show, and at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, do join Rosanna Lockwood for Global News Today. That's a roundup of top international news with exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from decision makers across the globe, including Kamala Harris's biographer Dan Moraine in the hot seat today.
Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan. So the debate is over, and the debate about the debate began immediately afterwards. Armed with only a pen, a pad of paper, a bottle of water, and their wits, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump came face to face for the first time in their lives last night on stage in Philadelphia. The vice president and the former president were prepared to do battle before an audience numbering tens of millions on TV and online across the US. But of course, the candidates had been preparing for this day for weeks. They've been working with a close-knit team of policy advisors and debating coaches. In this episode, we'll get an insight into what was happening behind closed doors in the run-up to this key moment in the election campaign. We'll also look back at some of the zingers and gaffes which became make-or-break moments during previous presidential debates. And we'll bring together Democratic and Republican leaders in a lively debate on the state of the race with just 8 weeks until polling day.
I think this debate might be one of the most consequential presidential debates that we've had in our history.
Brett O'Donnell is known to many as America's best debate coach. His clients included George W. Bush, John McCain, Mitt Romney, and Ron DeSantis. And he was twice named as being among the 5 most influential people not running for president. So he's the perfect guest to provide us with a look behind the curtain at the dark arts of election debates. Well, Brett O'Donnell, thank you very much for joining me. And I guess I should start by asking, from your experience and what you know about these two candidates, what do you think they've been doing to prepare for the debate?
Well, what we think we know are two different things, because candidates are usually pretty secretive about their debate prep, as they should be. But what we do know is that Kamala Harris has been hid away for about a week in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, doing debate prep, using a live stand-in for Donald Trump and doing mock debates. What we know, or we think we know about Donald Trump, is he has been reviewing policy with his advisors, talking through strategy, and he's been doing a ton of interviews. And I think he's using those interviews to try out lines of argument, to get himself ready and used to the bright lights of these big debates.
We have heard reports of a large man dressed like Donald Trump who was spotted near the site where Kamala Harris was preparing. Now, how far do coaches go to impersonate their clients' opponents?
Well, it depends upon the candidate and what they want. When we do debate prep like that, we have folks that will play the other candidate in the race, but we don't usually have them dress exactly like the other candidate or try to appear like the other candidate. We want them to sound like the other candidate, to make sure that our candidate is ready for the arguments that they will hear in the debate, and that practice debate is harder than the debate they'll actually do when they do the real thing.
Is it to some degree like rehearsing for a stage play or a movie? Do they have to become essentially like method actors?
Well, I don't think it's method acting, but it is based on performance. I mean, there's a lot that goes into this. It's not just a recitation of facts, and it's not really a debate. These debates are more about message and moments, and those moments are the thing which pick up the press fascination, like the Ronald Reagan age moment, or the George Bush moment when he looks off Al Gore in the debate, or different moments like that that are recorded in history of the standout moments from presidential debates. And so you do go through those, you rehearse them, and how you perform them matters, because folks take meaning away from not just what you say, but how you say it. And so smiling and making yourself open, an open communicator, doing things that cast yourself as likable, telling stories, connecting with the audience, all of those are things that are part of the overall performance that you have to perfect in order to do well in these political debates.
That's actually really interesting. And I wonder, in that case, how intense it gets. I mean, do the candidates during these rehearsals get peppered with insults and challenged very heavily in order to try to put them off their stride?
Absolutely. I've had presidential candidates get angry in practice mock debates and actually leave the room or end prep or get angry at the person who's the stand-in because they become so believable. You want those simulations to be just like the real thing. You don't want it to be something that's over the top or not realistic. You want those candidates to face what they're going to face when they step out on that stage.
Hopefully they don't take it out on you afterwards if it's that intense.
Right? The objective is to have them the most ready so that when they walk off of that stage, they say, that was way easier than prep.
What do you teach them about when it's best to attack and when it's best to defend?
Well, first of all, I think a candidate should always be on offense. But what I mean by offense is not necessarily attacking your opponent, but on your message, whether it's the affirmative message that you're pushing or the message that you want to push on another candidate. Because if you slip into defensive mode, that lets the other candidate get on offense and gain the upper foot. These things are all judged by the public based on who is the most aggressive without being offensive. And so if you remember back to the very first Obama-Romney debate, Romney won that debate because he was on offense all the time on the economy, and it had Obama on his back foot. So you want your candidate to be leaning into the debate on message, on offense, either on their own message or on the message we're trying to push on the other candidate.
Brett, I wonder, are there any candidates that are effectively uncoachable or perhaps unwilling to be coached?
There are some. I've had a few who don't respond well to debate prep. They're know-it-alls. They think they understand how to do this better. And the best candidates I work with are the ones that are smart, they're coachable, they give input into the debate prep process. We don't try to change people into the worst thing you can do is make a candidate inauthentic, to make them into something or someone they're not. And so we don't want to do that, but we want that candidate to be as sharp as possible. And we've got experience. My firm has coached over 100 candidates in political debates, whether they're House debates, Senate debates, or presidential debates. We've done 6 presidential debates, 2 prime ministers in Britain. And so we kind of understand how these things work. And so we think we're really good at giving a candidate a strategy. The candidate has input in that strategy, and then we go practice it, and they make it their own.
As a Brit myself, I can't help but ask, how different did you find the British candidates compared with the US ones?
Every candidate is different, whether they're British, American, and we've worked in other countries as well. Every single candidate is different, and you adapt the prep process to that particular candidate. It's a matter of some liking some, working with some over others. We worked with both Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, and I found them both amazing people, very intelligent and great to work with.
Is it more important as a candidate in a debate to have more appeal in terms of personality and be likable as a person, or is the political competence a more important factor?
They're both very important. Voters vote for candidates for 3 reasons. One is they think they can do the job. it's a job interview. They can be president of the United States. They can make the tough decisions. They've got good policy plans. But the second and third reasons relate to that likability factor. Folks want to know that you're in this for them, that you have their best interest in mind, and then they want to like you. And we tend to vote for candidates that we like, that we think are doing this for us, and that we think can do the job. And, there's instances all through American presidential political history that bear this out. The public thought by a large margin that Mitt Romney would be better on the economy, but they liked Barack Obama better, and they ended up voting for him because they thought he was in it for them, and they liked him. And so they decided to go with someone that they thought was a little less competent on the economy, but that they'd like better.
You indicated each candidate is different, and I wonder how much you have to adapt your coaching methods to suit the skills, the weaknesses, the strengths of each particular candidate.
You have to adapt them all the time. Some candidates need work on the public speaking side. They need work on the argument side. Some candidates are very talented speakers and need help on the strategic side and how to formulate arguments or how to think about the strategy. And then you have some candidates who come in who have a great strategy and they just don't know how to execute it. So it's really a matter of what makes them comfortable, what makes them feel best prepared. John McCain was a talented speaker, very smart strategically, and just needed some help on execution and giving him some good lines to capture what he was trying to argue. And so we didn't do a lot of mock debates with Senator McCain. We did a lot more sitting around, talking through answers, talking about strategy than we did in mock debates. But then on the other hand, I've worked with candidates who like a lot of mock debates. They want to go through the practice. They want things to be and look exactly as they will on debate day. So it's a matter of what's best for that candidate.
Brett, I'm sure you'll agree, the presidential race, the election campaign is more of a marathon than a sprint, more like a steeplechase with barriers to overcome. And I wonder, when it comes down to it, within that timeline, within that longer timeline, how important a moment is the actual presidential debate for the candidates and for the audiences watching at home?
It's a great question. Normally, presidential debates are a part of the overall campaign narrative. And there are other things that are as important, whether it's the convention speech or the announcement speech or things like that. But in this particular instance, where Kamala Harris has only been a candidate for 50 days, has done only one major interview, has been off the campaign trail as much as she's been on the campaign trail, and we know very little about her, and that this will be the only debate they do, I think this debate might be one of the most consequential presidential debates that we've had in our history.
It's interesting you say that because I guess up to now, Donald Trump would have been preparing pretty much solely to talk and debate against Joe Biden. And now, of course, this new candidate has come up quite last minute and probably thrown quite a bit of a spanner in the works in his coaching sessions.
Sure, absolutely. When you change candidates toward the end of a race, you've prepared toward working toward being ready for that candidate. I mean, in every presidential campaign, you usually know who the candidate's going to be 8 or 9 months before the election. And so you're gearing up, preparing everything toward that specific candidate. But Joe Biden fulfilled what was the worst principle of political debates, which is you can't win an election, but you can lose it. He lost his election and ended his candidacy in a debate. And so now Donald Trump is facing a different candidate. That also presents challenges for Kamala Harris because she's little known. In the poll yesterday, 28% of all Americans say they need to know more about her before they can even consider voting for her, whereas that number for Donald Trump is below 10% at 8%. So I think there are challenges for both people going into this debate.
Brett, I'm sure you agree that to someone who watches elections so closely, you probably agree that Donald Trump is the kind of person who holds back no punches, which is a lot of the appeal for his particular supporters. I wonder what you expect coming out of a debate against someone like Kamala Harris, because last time against Joe Biden, Donald Trump came across far more presidential by holding back.
Yeah, and I think he's got to do that again. I think if he focuses on policy and makes this election a referendum on her administration, the Biden-Harris administration, and casts her policies as a weak, failed, dangerously liberal candidate, then he's on the right trail. If this becomes a sort of personality fest, personal attack debate, then that disadvantages him and it advantages Kamala Harris.
Brett, would you expect the two to debate once again before the final polling day?
I don't, actually. I think this will be the only presidential debate that we will have unless one of the candidates has a major stumble and slides back in the polls 4, 5, 6 points. Then they'll be clamoring for another debate. But my guess is this is going to be a razor-tight election, and that this debate will be consequential in giving momentum to one of the candidates, but I don't think it will give tremendous separation. It just may give them enough momentum to win the election.
Brett O'Donnell, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure speaking with you.
Great to speak with you.
Now we're going to bring you a debate of our own, and I'm delighted to be joined by a pair of leading political personalities with very different perspectives on the state of the presidential race. Amy Dacey was chosen by President Barack Obama to be his CEO of the Democratic National Committee, while Josh McCoon is chairman of the Republican Party in the important battleground state of Georgia. Amy Dacey and Josh McCoon, very glad to have you both on the show. I'm going to start with a question for both of you. Amy, perhaps putting it to you first. You know, compared with elections in recent times, how significant is the upcoming US presidential election for both the US and the global environment?
Well, we certainly have a habit of saying this is always the most important election of our lifetime. And I think this certainly has a lot at stake. I mean, I do believe that there's decisions that will be made within the next 4 years, things that will be happening in the U.S. and globally that matter a lot. And I think that is why you see, in this election environment, not only for the presidential, but we also have, in our federal government, Senate races and House races that will determine the position of power in those two chambers as well.
And Josh, do you see it the same way?
It's an incredibly important election. So many things have happened over the course of the last couple of years that are just unprecedented. The tactics of weaponizing the criminal justice system against political opponents in this country, depending on how this election turns out, that strategy is either going to be validated and something we're going to live with, I think, for the rest of our lives, or it's something we're going to turn away from. So I think this election is incredibly consequential for the future of American democracy.
Traditionally, the candidates would always espouse their policies in the campaigns. It seems very different nowadays. And I wonder, when the polls are indicating a very tight race, how important is a dominant performance at the presidential debate? I mean, who needs it the most? Amy, who do you think?
Well, I think it's important. It's certainly one of the tools in the toolbox of candidates to reach voters. I think there's been so much heightened energy around debates, especially after the debate between former President Trump and President Biden. But I do think it is that rare moment when both opponents are on stage at the same time, pushed to talk about their differences, their policies, what they will bring to the table. So, I do think that we'll see probably even a larger viewership than maybe even we have in the last one. But also the change now as well is you don't have to necessarily just watch the debate on debate night. There will be clips running all the next day. There will be analysis. So what happens between these two individuals on the debate stage will matter in setting the tone. Campaigns are about contrasts, and debates are the best way to kind of show that and showcase that.
But Josh, is it the policies or the personalities that people remember the most from debates when it comes to casting their vote?
Yeah, I think it's both. President Trump put out, I served on the platform committee at the Republican National Convention, and he came out with 20 explicit promises to the American people if he's elected. Things like no taxes on tips for service workers, no taxes on Social Security earnings. So President Trump has a very clear agenda for the next 4 years. Kamala Harris, It seems to change by the day. Her website still doesn't have any policy documents or white papers on it. But I think there's going to be a very significant contrast between the candidates there.
Now, Amy, of course, there is still the big issue of the fact that these are personalities. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, is it the policies or the personalities that will make the difference?
Well, I don't think that, this Republican candidate is about policies at all or progress. He's about popularity. I'd have to disagree with my fellow panelist. It's been very clear what the policies are going forward, with this Harris-Walz ticket. I think he should refresh his search engine because they've made it very clear on their website laying out what they're doing. This is a campaign that, as of 2 months ago, didn't know, the Harris didn't have the role of presidential candidate, but they've gone a long way. They've certainly made it much clearer, I think, at our convention, in the Democrats in Chicago about what that is. If you put that convention speech up against President Trump's, it's strikingly different. I think they've made it very clear what the vision is. I think they've also made it very clear the tone and tenor that they want to have moving forward and what's at stake. But I think they've also done it in an optimistic way, not talking just about what they're against. I think there's a very striking difference between these two candidates as far as personality. I think that's something that people do take into account. But I also think that, if President Trump decides to even talk about policy tomorrow night, it'll be interesting. It's not been what he's usually tended to do in these forums. But I do think it's what's driving this conversation. I think the Harris and Walz team have made it very clear what they stand for and what they're working on. They also are willing to talk about that Biden-Harris administration and the accomplishments that you've seen. President Trump was president for 4 years, and he doesn't really talk much about, what happened during those 4 years and what the vision is for the next 4.
I'll get into details in some of those things in a moment, but clearly President Biden's poor performance in his debate with former President Trump was a pivotal moment in this year's election race. But we've also seen other moments which seemed at the time that they might prove to be game changers. Donald Trump's defiant response to the assassination attempt was considered by many to have sealed his victory, but then his boost in the polls faded. And the jubilant scenes at the DNC after Kamala Harris's nomination led to an upsurge in confidence and mood, but it also failed to create a significant bounce in the polls. Is there a danger that we in the media, but also the politicians, get swept up in moments like these and this latest debate and the over-impact they might have on the voters, Josh?
Well, I think that's right. There's such an obsession with the horse race component of any campaign. I think it's everyone's always looking for that pivotal moment. The American electorate is largely divided with a small segment of voters that are going to decide this election. And what's very clear is that those voters are looking for a change. The idea that Vice President Harris wouldn't have any policy ideas because she wasn't the presidential nominee when she's been vice president for 3.5 years is a little bit difficult to swallow. This is a person who owns the last 3.5 years, the crushing inflation, the total abandonment of any pretense of protecting the southern border or ports of entry, and of course a world that is on fire. This vice president has sat with President Biden every week. She bragged about being the last person in the room when a lot of these decisions were made, like the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. People are tired of this. I go around the state quite a bit talking to Republicans, independents, and folks are ready for a change, and they're looking for the 4 years they had under President Donald Trump, where we had an economy that worked for everyone, where we had the lowest recorded level of illegal immigration ever recorded in American history, and a world that was at relative peace and prosperity for all. So I think that is what this election boils down to. A small segment of folks that are looking for who is the change candidate. And the change candidate is not the person that has been sitting at the table making the decisions of the last 3.5 years.
Amy, I want to get your perspective on this, on how perhaps, it is easy to get swept up in the debate issue and the impact it might have on voters as well.
Well, I think anybody who's a political operative for years realizes that this is something that we eat, sleep, and breathe, every day. And the American people, are concerned about those issues that matter to them most in their family every day. And so sometimes these monumental moments in elections are not what they, are focused on. But once the conventions were over, this is the general election, series during the campaign, and people are paying attention and people are gearing up. I think you saw a tremendous monumental jump in momentum, certainly after, the Democratic convention. I think you saw that with money, unprecedented amounts of money raised from new donors who hadn't given to the campaign before. I think you saw a huge number of volunteers that came to the campaign as well. And I will say that they are looking for something. They're looking for something that for people who share their values. I mean, to say change is going back to 4 years that were chaos under a global pandemic where there was mismanagement with the leadership, certainly at the top, at the presidential level. You're also looking at somebody who likes to divide the country rather than bring it together with his divisive language and how he's handled things. So I don't think people are looking for that. I think you really see them looking forward to this, hope, change moment, seeing about what's possible going forward, and really focused on the issues that matter to them. I do think these moments, polls are only a snapshot in time. These things, happen and we gauge them to see how people are doing. But I think you've seen, progression. Voters are voting in the next couple of weeks here in the United States. So I think these moments are important because people will be deciding very soon who they want to support. But I think for all the races up and down the ballot, it'll make a lot. There will be a lot of things that happen in the next few weeks that will matter as there, people still have an opportunity to register to vote in this country. There's a lot of energy and effort being put into voter contact and reaching these individuals in each individual state. So I think this is the season, the election campaign where all those things are happening. So it will be a heightened interest from the electorate.
Well, here's one really for both of you. I'm going to start with Josh on this one now. With so many swing states in play, which is the best route to the White House for either of the candidates?
Well, one of the advantages President Trump enjoys is he does have multiple paths to the White House. I think most of those do run through Georgia, but we're optimistic the president's going to win here. We've worked very hard. We think we're in a good position. Vice President Harris really needs to run the table of the so-called blue wall states. She's going to need to win in Michigan. She's going to need to win in Wisconsin. She's going to need to win in Pennsylvania. And so she's got to win more of these so-called swing states than President Trump. And again, if you look at the recent polling, if you look at the forecast from Nate Silver and others who have been at this a long time, they are looking at a situation where President Trump has the advantage. Of course, a lot of people think about the popular vote, but your viewers may not, be aware. These are 51 separate elections for presidential electors, and so the fact that Kamala Harris is going to win California and New York by significant margins doesn't really matter in the scope of things. You have to win the states that get you to 270, and I think President Trump has a decided advantage in terms of the number of pathways as well as the structural advantages he has in the states he needs to win.
Josh, I'm going to get back to Georgia in just a moment, but I want to get Amy's perspective on perhaps the best path for Kamala Harris to get to the White House.
Well, we have these traditional battleground states, the ones that Biden certainly won, in 2020. Those are Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. And those are the areas that, they'll be focused on, as well as, other states. I think that the bottom line is, the Trump campaign talked about in June and July that they were expanding, into states where they thought they can win. That is just not the case. And so it will be down to these states. I think if you follow the money where, money's being spent, I know the DNC just did another, infusion of cash into some of these battleground states and in down ballot races in these states. And then also where candidates are spending their time. That's the best indicator to see where they, have the best path to get through. But I think it's still those states. I think that's where they're investing, the Harris-Walz ticket is investing time, energy, and money. And then they will have a slew of surrogates that are out there as well. They also have some strong elected leaders in those states that serve as incredible surrogates that are doing, what they can in those states to try and gather support and momentum as well.
Josh, you indicated how important Georgia is. It looks like being one of those knife-edge states with voters split down the middle in recent polls. Now, the state's Republican governor, Brian Kemp, is well liked within the party. What do both of you think when you hear Donald Trump insulting him and his family? I mean, is it just a storm in a teacup, or could it cost the Republicans the election?
Yeah, you know, I think a storm in a teacup, something that the media and the Democrats were really hoping would turn into some sort of opening for them. And the door's really been slammed shut on that. You know, Governor Kemp has made it clear from the beginning that he supports the Republican ticket. He supports President Trump. He's appeared at fundraisers in support of the Trump campaign just within the last week or so. And of course, President Trump has had very kind things to say about Governor Kemp following his appearance on Sean Hannity's program. So, you know, we're seeing a unified Republican Party here in Georgia. We're seeing a candidate who enjoys enormous leads in polling on questions of who leads better on the economy, who leads better on immigration. And of course, the Lake and Riley tragedy here in Georgia has brought immigration to the fore. We have some other structural things happening. We have 3 additional candidates who have qualified for the presidential ballot here: Jill Stein, Cornel West, and Claudia De La Cruz. In a typical Georgia presidential election, there's a Libertarian, so there's a place for Republican protest votes to go. There's no similar opportunity on the Democratic side. That will not be the case this time. There'll be an equalized playing field with regard to that. So, you know, I feel optimistic. We got a lot of work to do over the next 2 months. But if we turn out our voters, I believe we're going to win and win with a margin.
Now, Amy, on the other hand, Mr. Trump has also praised Georgia election officials by name at his rallies. Now, these are people who, under a new state law, could decide when and whether to certify the election result. How justified are Democrats to worry that the former president is laying down the ground for challenging any negative results for the GOP?
We should be very worried. He doesn't have any respect for the process in a lot of these states, and we saw what happened after the 2020 election. I think there are concerns. Anybody who can, in one breath, you know, praise somebody and the next tear them down. This is goes to the character, certainly, of the former president. Again, I don't think he respects the process at all, and I just feel like that, you know, he's about winning this election, and if he doesn't, he will try to justify it in any way to try and dismantle decisions that are made by voters across the country.
Well, Josh, I want to get your perspective on that same issue.
Well, if we want to talk about dismantling the process, you know, Democrats pushed aside their nominee who got 14 million votes in primaries for someone who didn't win a single presidential primary. Here in Georgia, they've actually gone to federal court to try to prevent voters from having additional choices on the ballot. So Democrats are happy to be guardians of democracy as long as they can control who your choices are through non-democratic means. And, you know, I think President Trump has demonstrated throughout this campaign a commitment to a vision for the future that is optimistic, that is bright, that is a welcome relief for American families that are paying $28,000 more a year for basic necessities because of the inflationary policies of Vice President Harris. So, you know, I see a situation here in Georgia where we have a state elections board that respects the process. We have a state elections board that has adopted common sense rules about observing what happens when people go to the polls, making sure the number of voters agrees with the number of votes cast in a precinct. And actually, the rule adopted regarding certification doesn't invite the opportunity to delay certification. What it does is it empowers local elections officials to ask questions before they vote to certify an election. Because if we are not going to give them any opportunity to exercise independent judgment, there's really no point in the local certification process at all. So these are common sense changes that if people actually had the opportunity to vote on a ballot for these, would probably get 90% of the vote, because no one really objects to more eyes on the process, transparency in the process, and the ability for the folks that have been vested with the oversight of our elections to actually exercise that oversight.
Now, on another note, there was a lot of eager anticipation to know who the vice presidential picks would be. And one for both of you, and I'll start with Amy on this. How do you assess the impact and performance of those vice presidential picks so far?
Well, I do think that, you know, people vote for the presidential candidate. I think that necessarily the vice presidential pick doesn't determine what the election's going to be. But I think a lot of times what the vice presidential nominee should do is complement, you know, the leader, show that, you know, that they bring strengths to the table, a wealth of experience. And I think that you see that definitely in the Harris-Walz ticket. You see somebody who's been a public servant for a long time, certainly, you know, has been a teacher, a coach, as somebody who's, you know, served this country, you know, in military. Like, I do think you see somebody who has been involved both in Congress and both as an executive and a governorship. So he brings a wealth of experience to the ticket. And I think that he's been, you see that synergy with them out on the road and you know, what he's doing. I think, you know, definitely, you know, I think Trump picked his, you know, nominee in J.D. Vance for those probably same reasons to compliment him. I don't think that some of the remarks that he's made thus far have been really embraced, you know, by the rest of the country. I do think you know, can argue about where he can go and where, you know, he can campaign in. But I think both of these tickets, you know, will be out there trying to gather support. But I just see the Harris-Walz one as a very strong and significant decision that could help benefit that ticket.
Josh, getting your perspective on this too, I also want to ask you about comments that have been out in the media about former President Trump saying he would hold accountable those who he feels haven't really held up to what he expects from them during this campaigning period. I mean, he's kind of threatening people on that. What's your take on that too?
So I guess I'll start with the question about the vice presidential candidates. You know, Senator Vance, we had him here in Georgia about a year ago. Just a dynamic speaker, a quintessential American story, someone who grew up in difficult circumstances, which he obviously wrote about, a movie was made about, and was able to overcome those circumstances and really live out the American dream. And for people for whom that American dream seems further out of reach, 3.5 years on in this administration, that's a really compelling speaker to have out on the campaign trail. And obviously he does a great job staying on message. If you listen to his interviews on television, he's doing a great job for us there. You know, I think the pick of Governor Walz on the Democratic side just tells you a little bit more about the divide in the party over Israel and issues of anti-Semitism in this country. Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania was the obvious choice for Vice President Harris to make, but for her concerns of losing some support in Michigan and perhaps some other areas around the country. That's very worrying for those of us that believe strongly in the idea there needs to be a bipartisan consensus in our country in supporting the state of Israel. But your question regarding President Trump and what he's had to say, look, I said this at the beginning of the interview. We have had an unprecedented perversion of our criminal justice system. Here in Georgia, we have 3 presidential electors who are under indictment for going to a meeting to cast contingent electoral votes consistent with precedent in this country going back to 1960. And they've lost 3.5 years of their lives to a ambitious prosecutor who doesn't really care about enforcing Georgia laws, but wants to go after her political opponents. Of course, people that have been guilty of perverting our criminal justice system for political purposes ought to be held accountable. I think most people agree with that. I don't think it's about revenge or anything else. It's about what I said earlier, which is what separates the United States of America and other countries with robust democratic conditions from countries that we all agree don't have those, is that we do have an independent criminal justice system that calls balls and strikes, that where you don't get a different result when you go to court depending on which political party you belong to. And that's something I've lived with here in Georgia for the last 3.5 years. I watched our 16 electors, volunteers, people that didn't get paid a dime, who participated in a 26-minute meeting, be persecuted all over the state. An 80-year-old grandmother who had Fulton County DA investigators come to her home and interrogate her. It's disturbing. It's not anything that I thought I would ever see happen in this country, the freest country in the world. So I think when President Trump speaks about that, it's important. And unfortunately, so much of the other side of the story just has never been told because the people in a position to tell the story want to tell a very skewed version of what went on over the last 3.5 years in some of these so-called criminal investigations.
Amy, what's your perspective on this?
So I don't think that there's any place that you would say that Vice President Harris doesn't take these things seriously, that there was a lot that happened after the 2020 election where people were persecuted for doing their job and definitely administering the